och välkomna till Folkets Radio. Idag med Meia-Chita Tegmark. Välkommen!
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Great to have you. Meia is a researcher, a PhD in psychology. And the title of our conversation today is The War on Childhood. It's a heavy one. And this notion is not foremost an insight from your academical work and research, but rather from your experience of becoming a mother in United States of today. And it's a lot to unpack. Perhaps, Meia, before we start talking about the dysfunctional aspects of this topic, we could begin on a positive note regarding the connectedness with your child that you felt already during pregnancy.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is it's an unusual interview for me to give because I'm usually asked to speak, from the things that I study and, from the science that I do. But this is very personal. So it also makes me feel, vulnerable. And since we're talking about connectedness, also connected to whoever's listening right now, So motherhood was a big thing for me. I'm a psychologist, and my PhD is in developmental psychology, so in child psychology. So I went into it with all these ideas about, informed very much by my research about how it would be like. I had this plan of like testing my child with every single possible cognitive test and measuring the milestones. And it was both incredibly humbling and at the same time incredibly inspirational to have this experience and realize, how different the knowledge that you can get from experiencing something can be, as opposed to the knowledge you get from just like studying something in this sort of very abstract way. And I think for me, the most powerful thing about this experience has been connectedness. I remember when I was, like a little bit of a rebellious teenager reading a lot of dark psychology and philosophy. I had this quote that I had posted on my wall that said, it's from Conrad, The Heart of Darkness. And it said, we live as we dream alone. And that was very much my mantra throughout a bunch of my youth, that I'm alone, I'm an individual, I'm so alone, in this world. And then when I got pregnant, I remember that quote and I thought to myself, oh, so obviously this was written by a man who has never had this experience before, because it's just the most beautiful and intense feeling of connectedness, of being part of something bigger, of transcending, because you're literally two people at the same time. So there's this very, very intimate relationship that you're building with another being, and you get to experience what it's like to be another being and another person to be you at the same time. So that has been for me amazing. And I think people have these sort of transcendent experiences through all sorts of things. Like some people have maybe mystical experiences. Some people, realize that they're very connected with nature in various forms. But for me, definitely this being pregnant and having my son and, continuing this relationship with him has been, by far the most transcendent and amazing experience that I've ever had.
Yeah. So when you were about to give birth, when the time had more or less come, the natural process was sort of interrupted in a very harmful way. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so for a long time, I actually thought that this was a very, bad things happen, and it happened to me, but that's not typical of other people. But since then, of course, I don't research this field. I'm not a neonatologist. I'm not an OBGYN. But when I go to the park and I talk to different mothers, of young children, I think so far I have heard of, in the US, no woman that has not had some sort of medical assistance or some sort of inducement process, so like provoking birth. And it's really, really scary. So what ended up happening to me is, for the last visit of my pregnancy, without informed consent, they actually did a procedure that induced birth, which led to a sort of cascading effects. It was like literally in bed in pain, for squirming for 2 days. Then my water broke. Then I had no contractions. Then I had to go to the hospital. Then I had to wait for 24 hours and be given a lot of synthetic hormones, and still nothing was happening. And I had my child after 36 hours through a C-section and an infection, which led to him not breastfeeding, which led to me having to breast pump for 10 months, which is it's really, really difficult for the women who are listening to this and who have had similar experiences. I'm sure they can empathize. So I was for a long time, I couldn't even talk about this. I was so upset about it. And at the same time, I felt like, I should be grateful that I got medical care. I should be grateful that my child is alive. But I think with time, I came to the idea and the conclusion that, yes, it's absolutely wonderful, to have hospitals and to have possibilities to, like increase child survival rates and so on. But it's really evil, I think, to use all these fantastic tools that we have and all this technology that we have to create so much misery and pain and interrupt processes that are already there and they're fine. Most likely I would have had a very, Mother Nature would have had prepared me to give birth naturally. So I think, this is, it's a very, it can be a very traumatizing thing for a lot of people. And I think a lot of women are silent about it because they are told that this was the best option and that they had no other options. And I've heard so many stories of confused women who just didn't know how to, they don't even know how to process this, how to think about what happened to them.
So that was the sort of a beginning of a long journey then. And then you talked about this fantastic feeling of connectedness you had already with your child when he was within you. And then this was sort of interrupted by force after you gave labor, right?
Yeah, indeed. Even before, right? I think when I was thinking about, trying to understand and wrap my mind around where is this coming from, what's happening, is this just a weird one-off experience, or is this more of a trend? I remembered this movie. I think it was from some like early 1990s, which was called Girl Interrupted. It's a sort of a story about this woman who ends up in, who's perfectly normal, but like ends up in this mental institution with a lot of other troubled women. And I think the message of the movie is, society interrupted her development. And many times I kept thinking of my story as that, it's like motherhood interrupted, somebody interrupted this process that would have otherwise been natural and probably much more beneficial both for me and for my child. And now, I'm thinking of it, like the more I think of it, the more I see this as a more general pattern in society. I think it's not just motherhood interrupted and childhood interrupted, but if you go deeper, I think it's transcendence interrupted. I think that the societies that we create have this almost like this agenda of like turning us into individuals very fast, very soon, breaking all our transcendence, breaking our connection to nature so we don't feel part of a bigger whole, so we can, actually feel nothing when other species are being, literally exterminated. We get severed from our family ties. We get severed from our children. There's all this every time we try to get out of ourselves and, connect. Like it seems like we keep being reminded, sometimes quite brutally, forcefully, that we are separate, that we are individuals, that we need to, break that tie, break that connection. It's almost like a like a copy, like an artificial copy of each other. Yes, we're separated from each other. In that sense, we're individuals, but our connectedness, our ties are severed. But we are not individuals in the sense of like being able to think for ourselves and determine our own fate.
So if we just take it from the very beginning, after this cesarean, this forced deliverance, then what was the first separation then? Did they not allow you to keep him with sleep together with him, or can you just take it from the very beginning?
Yeah, so in the US, there's a big policy on no co-sleeping. So you're told for a long time you were told that you had to sleep in a separate room from the child from birth. Then recently, actually, the recommendation has changed because there have been so many instances of children, infant death syndrome, from children dying in their own rooms, that now they recommend that you sleep in the same room, but your child has to be in a separate crib or bassinet, or and now they make these things that can actually play white noises and rock your child. So it's a little bit of a robot cradling your kid, a robotic bed cradling your kid all the time. So so for me personally, after having a C-section and going through this traumatic experience, I just wanted to be with my child at all times. Like hormones were starting to kick in, and I had almost this like strong anxiety being separated from my child. And I didn't have milk, I couldn't breastfeed. So I was trying to get that started. And one thing you do that is, of course, is have a lot of skin on skin connection with your child. So I was trying to keep my child at all times with me. But of course the policy was that I couldn't sleep. So I was in the hospital for a whole week. My baby had, some other problems, health problems. They kept monitoring him. I think I can't prove this, of course, but my intuition tells me that he would have been happy for another couple of weeks or so inside me, and they took him out too early, and that caused a lot of these things, extra complications. So anyway, I was trying to be with him at all times, but then they would literally come and check on me to make sure that my eyes were open at all times. So I ended up like a whole week of like not sleeping. And this was like in a bed with railing and several adults in the room that were awake. And, I was like, I obviously wasn't, I wasn't intoxicated. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't taking sleeping pills. I wasn't doing anything that would have like impaired me to, react normally. I mean, I think a lot of mothers will probably identify that, your sleep patterns change as a mother, and like the waking sleeping cycles change quite a bit, and you don't sleep quite as deeply. And you have this, even in your sleep, you have this awareness about your child at all times. So anyway, all of that was not impaired by anything external, but still they wouldn't allow me. So it was just, yeah, those days in the hospital, I remember it's a miracle that I can remember them, because it was just literally a lot of, I think, emotional and cognitive torture, really, and physical, but like that's a separate part.
Mm. So there's a lot of talk in our society about attachment style, that it's so important to get a secure and safe attachment. And then as you have discovered, becoming a mother, and so that there's so many things in the way society is constructed which is really interrupting attachment.
Yes, I think it's hypocritical of us to keep talking about attachment style, especially in adulthood. We start talking about them when it interferes with romantic relationships, right? And then we have to send people to psychologists and treat them and so on. But we don't, like, it's baffling to me that we don't have that. We don't introspect on like, why do you get to that point where you have very insecure attachments, right? And I think it's, that this constant separation. I actually didn't know this. Of course, I studied attachment theory as a, part of my PhD studies, and I even wrote a bunch about attachment and formation of attachments. I didn't realize this, though. I read later on that actually Bowlby, who came up with the theory of attachment, I knew about the part where he was actually observing children in orphanages after the Second World War. And what he realized is back then people thought that, okay, well, if you feed the child, if the child is fed, it's clothed, it's, has water, then all his physical needs are met, that's fine. Then the rest is like, it doesn't matter who provides that. It's just as long as all of these are provided. And they didn't realize that actually children needed a connection, a very strong emotional bond with a person that was like there for them all the time, that was a primary caregiver. So they kept having in the orphanages that people would finish their shifts, would go home, another person would come, some people would work there for a few weeks, then they would move on. And so these children had attachment that was constantly disrupted. But what I didn't know was that actually Bowlby himself, he was apparently the child of a fairly well-to-do family who had a bunch of nannies who was taking care of him. So he had very little connection with his own mother and very little connection with his own father. And he went through a series of very traumatizing experiences where he lost his nanny, who was like his primary source of love and protection. So he wrote a lot from his own experience, I think. And because of his own experience, he ends up, talking about us and studying it later in life. So, yeah. And I think, we keep redoing this. It's almost like, it's almost like the ostrich with the head in the sand. We're like, we don't want to look at this part of when you're most vulnerable, when when the child needs the caregiver and their mother, particularly their mother, the most, because because of that physical bond with the mom. And society keeps telling us things like, you have to separate you have to train your child. Even using the word train is like, to me, it sounds so off, right? And it doesn't come from a realization of, it doesn't come from a culture of loving and giving. It comes from a culture of discipline and chastising. I remember my pediatrician, who's actually a very nice person, and actually he's a very world traveled and like has much more of he's very soft spoken and has a more international perspective on this. I remember for the 4th month visit, he was trying to giving me the rules of how do you sleep train your child, and he kept insisting that that the child will be fine. It's fine. It reached a certain weight, so you don't need to feed the child anymore during the night. And because it has this particular length and this particular weight, and it passed the sort of a risk phase, so it's okay to put the kid in the other room or put the kid in his own crib and let him sleep. And I just couldn't do it. Like intuitively, I couldn't do it. And he kept telling me things like, sort of half joking to me. It's successive visits. I kept saying, no, I'm still feeding him at night. Yes, I'm still feeding him at night. Yes, at 6 months, at 8 months, at 10 months. Yes, I'm still feeding my baby and I'm still cradling my baby. And the pediatrician was saying things like, well, you do know that, he wants the milk, but he doesn't need it. And I was like, well, define need. My baby wakes up at night, very distraught. He's crying and the milk soothes him. And that's, he gets comfort from it. It's like, what does it mean to need? If need only means gaining a certain amount of weight, and just if you define it purely physically, then yeah, maybe I agree with you that 200 grams here or there doesn't really make a difference for the body weight. But what about the emotional need? Is that not a valid need? Is the need for comfort? Isn't the need to feel, sort of loved, heard, soothed? Is that not a need? Is that not a valid need? And I honestly think that this is a more general thing. I think that all this, obesity epidemic in the US is also part of the reason, because we think of food as poorly purely just nutrition for its nutritional value, but actually eating is a social thing. It's a nurture thing. It's something that sort of nature gives us and we ingest, and it soothes us emotionally also, and especially for children, for young babies. So yeah, the separation between the physical and the emotional is baffling to me.
I just want to stay on this topic a little, but the sort of sleeping training, because I actually happened once to have dinner to my uncle. My late uncle was a good friend and a neighbor, actually, with a Bernd Eckerberg. He was a Swedish child psychiatrist who championed this model. So that the idea is that you put the child to sleep and you say, good night, I'm going to be in the other room, don't worry. And then, if it's screaming, then you go away. And then I think it's like every day you wait a little bit longer. And then finally you don't come back at all. And it just screams until it finally basically chokes itself to sleep. And then, so I remember that was during a time when Simon, my son, was just like 1 year old. And we would never want to do like that. So I asked him, but how do you know that the child is not, taking any damage from this? Oh, he said, it's very well researched. We've been following this up, for several months afterwards. Several months, but what about several years? I know that the child psychiatrist Gabor Mate, a Canadian, he actually thinks that this is one of the most serious traumas you can give to a child, because what he says, what is happening is that the child is finally giving up, and in a way it's losing its basic trust in that somebody close is going to come and be there for him. How do you see this dynamic?
Yeah, I couldn't do it either. I was told exactly the same thing, but that's exactly what I should do. Just let the child, scream himself to sleep. And I think that, well, it's a long story, but I think that, if we also desensitize ourselves to that, I think that that's not just damaging the child, it's damaging the parent. And I think there's a whole different aspect of this, and maybe we can talk about it now or some other time, but it's not just damaging for the child, it's damaging for the parent also. It breaks something in you to, it's just like when it's a very well known and very well studied, these types of things, when you make somebody do something bad, that you are desensitizing somebody to doing something that seeing suffering, seeing another person crying and seeing another person in pain, and you train them to not react. The militaries do that all the time, for example. That actually can have a lot of repercussions, for the person who's doing it, as well as for the person to whom it is done. Yeah, there are many. There are a bunch of voices now, like Darcia Narvaez. I think you cite her amply in your book, and you know her work, who are now speaking against this and are saying exactly what you're saying, that, and what Gabor Mate is saying, that this is actually cruelty. It's just not responding and literally confining. Solitary confinement is considered like the worst form of punishment in prisons. This is actually not my idea. This is Darcia's idea, right? But we do that to our children, and we think that that's totally fine. Like, we confine them to their cribs, we confine them to their rooms, we turn off the light, and we leave. And we don't provide nurture when they need it. There's another aspect about this that's a little bit insidious. I've never read this before, and maybe it's research. But I noticed it with myself. I noticed how important it is also, like, there's this other aspect of desensitizing the mother. And one of the ways that you do it is by stopping breastfeeding. I remember when I finally stopped, that it's like, it was such a mental shift. Like, until then, I had a big sense of anxiety whenever I was separated from my child, because probably the hormones were keeping us very connected. And I remember after I stopped breastfeeding, I was like, oh, okay, I could imagine myself sleeping a night away from my child. Of course, I stopped later, but like, mothers, there are many mothers who have to stop at 3 months. In the US, actually, a maternity leave is 6 weeks long for those who are lucky. Some women go to work after 2 weeks after giving birth, and it's just not sustainable for them to continue breastfeeding. So when you sever that bond, that tie, that hormonal link that keeps making you seek your child and makes you incredibly sensitive to any child's cry, that's another way in which society disrupts this whole bond that's being created and put there by nature that we've evolved to have.
And I think also, to just expand on this, what you said about putting your child and letting it scream itself to sleep, it sort of goes so much against your maternal intuition. And sort of we're being programmed not to listen to that, and to the system, science, whatever they call it, knows better. I remember when my son was going to begin in daycare, he was almost 2 years old, which is by Swedish standards quite late. But anyway, we left him there the first day, the second day, and he was crying, and the whole place was a newly constructed daycare, and it was, when you came there, you didn't hear any laughter or joy, you just heard crying and screams. And I remember both me and his mother, it just doesn't feel right. And then I remember the woman who was working there at the daycare, and she said, you should just leave him and go away, because he see that you are here. He doesn't understand what it's all about. So you should just go. But we just decided we just can't leave him like that. And then we found what do you call, dog mama, an alternative where there's one person, caregiver, who has a small group, and it was much better. But I remember that what we really were encouraged to do was to go against our most basic intuition. This tells us you don't leave your child with strangers when he's crying. You just don't do that. And I think that those are like the same kind of instincts that probably is what nature is all about. Like migratory birds, they know when they're supposed to fly to another continent. You have these things deep inside. And when we program ourselves to, as you say, desensitize ourselves, yeah?
Exactly. And I mean, what, like, more than a child screaming and getting blue in the face, with from distress, I don't know what other signal could there be that's more clear that child needs soothing and that child is distraught.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, and I remember some of the first gifts that I got as a new mom were books on sleep training, with these, and I even remember reading the preface of this chapter, the chapter that was supposed to teach you how to sleep train your child. That was something like along the lines of first of all, let's talk about how we should not feel guilty about this. And there's this whole list of reasons why you shouldn't feel guilty about doing this. And then it literally had this big, bold black letter saying, okay, so now, since we are not guilty for doing this, let's do it. Let's these are the steps to do it. And I remember feeling very horrified. And I don't know what it's like in Sweden, but here in the US, it's, the first question you get asked once your child is more than 4 months old is do they sleep through the night? Does the child sleep through the night? And you sort of get bonus points. And if you're a mom who's hasn't managed to do this fantastic thing of sleep training your child, you're a little bit you get the corner eye, and you get this is a failure mom who has not managed to separate from the child. And so, yeah, I think there are many, many mechanisms at play for this. I used to work, and this is probably slightly taking it in a slightly different tangent, but there's also this aspect including technology, anything, so that you don't have to be the one who offers this comfort, that you don't need to be the one offering herself. There's now all these special cribs, with special sounds and special rocking motions, and they've researched now exactly how they should be rhythmic enough, but varied enough that the child is supposed to go to sleep faster. And Not to mention things like later on screens and so on. And I used to, work a lot in artificial intelligence, and a lot of these things were targeted towards children, actually. I think for a lot of roboticists, especially those who create what they call social robots, companion robots, the dream was to have them take care of the elderly and the children. So to me, it's always like society really values one individual and one type of individual only, which is the producing and consuming middle-aged adults, right? Who has financial independence and can, work to exhaustion and shop till they drop. And all the other ages, we want technology to take care of them. We want others to take care of them. We want, we just want to pass them by. I still remember actually during COVID, when there were lockdowns and stuff, I was reading, some blogs and things, from people. And I remember one post that really horrified me. It was this mother who I empathized with. And she was like, I can't deal with this. I have to work from home and I have 2 children that I have to take care of at the same time. So I empathize with that. It's very, very difficult, right, to do that. But what she was saying is that the ending of her post was, when I got pregnant, I had planned, my plan all along was to be away from my children 80% of the time so I could do my career, that I'm not, I don't mean to shame women who want to have a career. I think that's a perfectly wonderful thing to do. But I think there's something to be said about a society that, pushes women to do that. And at the same time doesn't provide a community, doesn't provide other forms of nurture that are like human based for children, but and intensely social and emotional and physical even.
Yeah, you mentioned what's her name, Narvaez. She's a scholar who studies indigenous cultures and how they take care of children. So if you would just sort of analyze this disconnecting culture of childhood, this war on the child, what do you think is really at the root of this?
Well, there are many different things, but I think one that is striking me more and more, that I think of more and more, is sort of the very way in which we see childhood. We can talk about why we see childhood this way, but I think in a lot of Western cultures and Western societies, we have this idea that children are somehow flawed adults. Like they're these things that need to be shaped into proper adults. And I think it probably has some religious roots as well. Like a lot of religious traditions actually have these ideas that women and children are inferior and need to be guided and trained. And I mean, we talked about the word training. I think in a way it's a euphemism for, causing your child quite, distress, a lot of distress. So you don't call it like letting your child letting your child cry himself to sleep, but you call it sleep training, like a euphemism. But I think that the word training also betrays something else, betrays this idea that you're thinking that a child needs that. We don't take children as, these perfectly natural stage in life, and this wonderful, perfect gift from nature as they are, and we don't trust that they will develop into adults. We have to train them into being certain ways. So I think there's a lot of that. So from the child point of, like, from the point of view of like what we think about the children, I think that's the prevailing narrative, that the child is always sort of sneaky and wicked and trying to trick you. And there's a lot of talk like that, even with child training. It's like, well, they don't need it, they want it. They're sneaky. They're trying to get you to pay attention to them. They're trying to get you to soothe them. They're trying to get you to hold them. They're trying to get you to like constantly cuddle them and tell them a story and stuff like that. It's as if that was some sort of like wickedness. They don't actually need it, but they're tricking you into this. And there's a lot of this narrative that is being promoted in these sort of sleep training, room training, food training circles. And then from the point of view of the adult, I think, what we talked about earlier, right? I think we want to be separate individuals who have no ties, who are completely, self-dependent, and we don't depend on anybody else, and we don't need anybody else, and it's just us. And I think, it's commodifying childcare and child rearing. It's just like commodifying romance through apps and Tinder, and, like commodifying a lot of other things in life that we just sort of we don't strive anymore to, we don't want we don't want to go through the hard part of a lot of these relationships.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about AI. That's one of the fields of your research, how AI is manipulating us, and some people even think that we're getting close to the time where AI is so advanced that it can hijack the human mind. And you and I have talked about this in a previous interview. So on a deeper level, like if a child is really connected, or if it is not, if it's being sort of, it gets this war on childhood, which has this severe effects on attachment and everything. Do you think that this could also affect how resistant that individual will be against the manipulations of AI?
I certainly think so. I don't think that there are like systematic studies out there showing this. Well, not that I really know of. I think probably we're trying to avoid doing those studies, but we won't like what we find. But we talk about connectedness, right? And we talked a lot about this like fantastic, transcendent human bonding meaning of connectedness. There's another meaning of connectedness that I think we vehiculate much more these days. It's like, if you're not connected to your mom and to other people and to your family, you're connected online, you're connected to a computer, you're connected to the internet, you're connected to all these other things, So you'll find a connection. The question is, what connections do we want to invest in, and what connections do we want our children to have with what, right? What are they connected to? And there are many problems now. There's a fantastic book by Jonathan Haidt that just came out not too long ago. It's called The Anxious Generation. Every parent should take a look at it, I think. That talks exactly about this, about like incredible like mental health downsides of having children connect to technology too early. But yes, I mean, the children don't have another option. Being a mother in modern society, you do things like shop for strollers and things like that. They have like iPad holders for strollers these days, for strollers. I mean, it's just, it's crazy. It's like you have the forward-facing stroller, so you don't look at the mother, because the mother is probably on her phone also, or the nanny is probably on her phone, and the child is on the iPad. And it's sad, but I think it says something about what our priorities are.
Yeah. So you have a PhD, you have spent a lot of time on elite universities. So when you're being told by experts that this is what the science says, there are consensus how you put the child to sleep, you shouldn't worry about this or that. How do you find it within you to sort of not accept that, even though if they say that this is the consensus of science, this is how you should do?
And I started this interview by saying how humbling this experience of motherhood has been for me, because it really, I guess, it put me in touch with another form of knowing, and another, I used to go through life through just, rigorous analysis. And I've been going through life in the past 2 years since I've had my son through just my gut feeling and intuiting my way through it. And it's been a difficult transition. I mean, you take all these years of like spending with my nose in books, and now I have to look my child in his eyes, and I'm like, okay, what do I do? So it's not easy. It's definitely not easy, and I personally have not encountered a lot of support. I think I'm considered very, very fringe, very extreme in my parenting ideals. I feel like I need to start almost every conversation with any new parent that I meet by saying, "Hey, look, I'm considered extreme, just so you know, like FYI, like this is me." And it's been hard to embrace it. And I think, I've also been incredibly lucky and very privileged that I was able to sort of afford being home with my child. Most mothers don't have that opportunity, definitely not in the United States. And I've had the privilege also of like having my mother help me out. So, sort of this like women bonding. A lot of grandmothers don't want to be grandmothers. They want to do something else with their lives. And so, yeah, I don't want to sound like a prescription book for everybody. I understand that it can be very, very difficult for a lot of people to do what I've done. So even for me, it's been hard. So I can only imagine it can be very, very hard for others. But on the positive side, though, I think that there are actually voices from prestigious universities with PhDs, people trained in the scientific method, people who are actually conducting studies who are now coming out and saying, no, actually all of this, we got it all wrong. This is wrong. What we're doing is wrong. And, I've taken great courage in doing what I'm trying to do with, raising my child. From, for example, reading The Evolved Nest, which is Narvaez Garcia's book, which has been very influential, and it's confirmed a lot of the things that I was sort of like intuitively doing, and I was like, oh yeah, totally, yes, this is exactly how I feel, in explaining it in a more sort of scientific way. So I think there are people out there, and you can definitely find your tribe if any of this resonates with you, with any of the listeners. There are resources and there are books, there are movements. There's this movement sort of called gentle parenting that's advocating for more of these sort of, nature-friendly techniques of raising children and so on. So there's hope, but it's difficult. It's hard. I understand that.
Yeah, you don't know if you should laugh or you should cry. I'm an extremist. I pick my child up when he's screaming. Maybe you're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's really like this is sort of the mommy culture is just so incredibly vicious. Also, just so vicious. Like there's nowhere. I've never found this. I mean, I'm a scientist. As a scientist, you're trained to having people tell you you're wrong all the time. That's the whole scientific process. You create something, and then a few people criticize it, and then you improve it. I mean, like your whole life is basically being criticized, but I've never encountered that amount of like vehemence as I have in the mother culture. And I think people need that. I think when you're doing something that goes against your intuition and you feel sort of forced into doing it, like you have to, really kind of want to protect that, and you don't want to hear the voice of reason. You don't want the dissenting parent amongst your midst, because, it just make you feel much more uncomfortable, because it really, you realize that they might be right. So I think there's some sort of some dynamic of that sort going on too. So yeah.
So finally, before we wrap up, do you have any thoughts on how to resist this assault on childhood and the connection between us and our children? How we can sort of create a culture of resistance?
I think, first of all, it starts with you, right? Just do what you think is right. And I keep this is my message to every single new mom that I encounter. It's like, you are right. You know your child, you know yourself. You just listen to what your heart and what your gut is telling you. Because nature has prepared you to do exactly that. And your child might be unique. I mean, every child is unique. And I think every mother, is like, if you listen and like, if you're paying attention, you will know what's right and what's wrong for you and for your child. And it's very humbling, honestly. It's just so humbling to see how I keep thinking that I have to teach him things, but truly I have to teach myself, or like reteach myself, because he's so ready to embrace it. Everything. We found a caterpillar in the snow the other day, and we like saved the caterpillar. And I was like, first I was like, "Ooh, I don't know," but then he was like, "Yeah, well, okay." It's just like he was very open to the experience. Loves to have it crawl on his hand. Yesterday, he found an ant in the house, and he was just like showing it to me. So little cute things like this, where you just realize how much maybe we've lost and how much we actually need to learn, not just from nature and books and experts, but actually from our own children. And they can probably be an even better guide than so many of the things that we call experts. Maybe after all, maybe this is at the bottom of it, is like, listen to your children. Maybe that's our best chance to get out of this this culture of sort of disconnection and I don't know, hyper extreme and pathological individualism. We should probably listen to our children who have not been spoiled yet.
Meia-Chita Tegmark, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.